Thomas and the Fat Controller's Engines. Dear friends, I went to see the Fat Controller the other day. I told him that in 1995 it would be 50 years since the first stories about his railway were published. Goodness gracious me, he said. We must do something to celebrate that. And he set to work. Not everything went quite right. For instance, Thomas... But I won't spoil the stories. Happy reading. The author, Christopher Audrey. BIRDSTRIKE. I know what a Jubilee is, announced Henry. It's an engine called Bahamas. I met him at Crewe. Isn't it a sort of party? Asked Percy. Thomas and I took some scouts to one once. That was a jamboree, put in Thomas with a chuckle. Oh, was it? Said Percy. Sorry. Gordon smiled. Actually, it's a train, he said knowingly. Flying Scotsman told me. The Silver Jubilee used to run from London in the old days. But we're not in London, objected Henry. And if it's a train, why do we need it? James continued. We don't, interrupted a well-known voice. Our Jubilee is a golden one because in 1995 it is 50 years since stories about us began to be in books. I thought it would be a good idea to celebrate. It is a party, squeaked Percy excitedly. The Fat Controller laughed. Sort of, Percy, he agreed. I haven't worked out the details yet, but you will all know about it in plenty of time. The engines were excited. Will there be a special train? Gordon asked the Fat Controller. Can I pull it, please, sir? Sorry, Gordon, said the Fat Controller. There will be a special train, but I can't spare you, I'm afraid. Anyway, haven't you forgotten how you had coal and water problems on the other railway? Gordon had. You remember Pip and Emma, don't you, Gordon? The Fat Controller went on. I have asked them to be my special train for the guest from London. Gordon puffed away. Near Henry's tunnel, the main line passed through woodlands, and the high branches of trees were full of birds' nests. Often, great flocks of birds circled above the railway, and sometimes Gordon had noticed them feeding in the fields nearby. Today, the birds were much closer to the railway than usual. Whistled Gordon as he approached the farm crossing. Startled, the birds rose to get away from the thick black cloud. They swooped across the line and in front of the train. One bird, larger than the others, had been perched on the gatepost beside the line. It flew so close to Gordon that its wings almost brushed his nose. As it did so, there was a bump, and Gordon felt his brakes come on. Why are we stopping? Gordon asked his driver. Perhaps someone has pulled the emergency brake, said the driver. Don't worry, the guard will come and tell us in a minute. But the guard had no idea what was wrong. There must be a leak in the brake pipe, said the fireman. He inspected the pipe from one end of the train to the other, but he could find nothing wrong. I can't understand it, said the driver, scratching his head. There isn't a leak anywhere, yet the brakes are on. It was just when those birds flew across, said Gordon. One nearly hit me, and there was a bump. Just a minute, interrupted the fireman. He looked quickly at Gordon's brake pipe. There you are, he said triumphantly. The fireman laughed. That bird knocked the seal out of your brake pipe, he explained. Look. Well, I'll be blessed, said the driver. I've never heard of a bird strike on an engine before. A crow did it on the Great Western Railway in 1915, chuckled the fireman. I read about it only last week. Gordon was soon on his way again. The other engines laughed. Poor old Gordon, they chuckled to each other. Fancy being stopped by a bird. That's nothing to crow about, isn't it? Edward and the Cabbages. Edward's branch line runs from a station at the bottom of Gordon's Hill. It goes along the coast to a port where the twin tank engines Bill and Ben work. Edward and Boko run this line, and Donald and Douglas, the Scottish twins, help them when things are busy. They all work happily together. Their trains don't need to run fast, but it is not often that they keep the big engines waiting. Usually, it is the big engines who are late. One morning, James was delayed at the big station, and Edward had to wait for him. When at last he could start, he wanted to hurry to make up for lost time. "Steady, Edward," cautioned his driver. "I know we're late, but an accident will make us even later." Edward slowed, but as he approached the next station, his wheels jolted badly at some points. When Edward had stopped at the platform, the fireman checked him all over, but everything seemed to be in order. Edward set off again. He was beginning to gain speed when he began to feel funny again. "My front is all wobbly," he complained, scarcely as he had said it, when he saw something bumping along the line beside him. "Jiminy Christmas, look at that!" he exclaimed. Quickly, the driver crossed the cab, and both watched in horror as a round metal object rolled along beside them, like a hoop. After a while, it hit a stone and bounced away into a field. Very carefully, the driver applied the brakes, and Edward came safely to a halt. He was glad because his front now felt very loose. The driver and fireman climbed down and came to look at his wheels. There was no doubt on what the trouble was. One of them wasn't there. "One of your bogie wheels has broken off," said the driver. "Thank goodness we were on a straight track and not going too fast. There could have been a nasty accident." A little later, the Fat Controller's telephone rang. He listened in astonishment. "What did you say? An engine's wheel in your cabbages?" "I quite agree. It must have been a great surprise." "One of Edward's, do you think? Is he all right?" "Thank you. I'll see to it at once." The Fat Controller put the telephone down and mopped his face with a red and white spotted handkerchief. "Phew! Bless my soul," he said to himself. "It's a good thing Edward didn't end up in the cabbages himself." The next day, Boko helped Edward to the works. Edward's wheel, broken off where the axle joined, but otherwise undamaged, travelled in his tender. The Fat Controller came to see him. "You had a lucky escape, Edward," he said, "but there's no harm done. I just hope we can get you mended before the Golden Jubilee celebrations. Oh, and by the way, the farmer says that if your driver wants cabbages in the future, there are much better ways of cutting them." Rabbits. "Rabbits," said the driver. "What do you mean, rabbits?" asked Thomas. His driver laughed and pointed ahead. Beside the line near the airfield station was a post with a white disc on top. The disc had a red circle round it and a black number 10 painted on it. "Rabbits have been building burrows under the line," the driver explained. "They have made the ground unsafe, so the Fat Controller has to bring in a speed limit here until the embankment can be straightened." "But it's the steepest part of the line," protested Thomas. "How shall I get up the hill when Annie and Clarabelle are full on market day if I can't increase my speed at the bottom?" "You'll manage," said his fireman, "but Percy's trains are often heavier than ours. He won't like it much." Percy didn't. One day, he stuck halfway up. Daisy had to wait at the station at the top, while Percy's train was divided and brought up in 2 sections. "The sooner the Fat Controller does something about these rabbits, the better," all the engines agreed. Then they heard that work was to start. While repairs were being done, Thomas was to run to the station at the top of the hill. Bertie would then carry the passengers to the airfield station, and Daisy would take them to the junction. The day before the line closed, Thomas was taking Annie and Clarabelle down the hill when he felt the rails quiver under his wheels. "Help!" exclaimed Thomas. Suddenly, the left-hand rail tilted. There was a crunch, and his wheels settled on the ballast. Luckily, Thomas stopped moving before Annie and Clarabelle came off the rails too. The guard went back to the station to telephone for help. Percy was shunting when the call came through. "You can't take those trucks to the harbour now that the line is blocked," said the station master. "Please take some workmen, bring Annie and Clarabelle home, and then help Thomas." Thomas was glad when Percy arrived. While Percy took the passengers to the station, the workmen unloaded their gear and prepared the site. "The ground's unsafe for a crane, even if we had one," they said, "and we can't just pull you out because that will only damage more of the line. We shall lift you on jacks, Thomas, so that we can slide rails underneath your wheels. Then Percy can pull you back onto firm rails. We hope," they added. "How long will that take?" asked Thomas. The foreman shrugged. "Who knows?" he said. 2 hours? Maybe 3? Slowly, with a jack on each corner of his frame, they lifted Thomas until they could slide lengths of rail laid on their side under his wheels. Then, very gently, he was lowered onto the rails. A strong cable was fixed to his coupling, and the other end was fastened to Percy. The Fat Controller came to watch. "Are you ready?" "Heave!" he called to Percy. Carefully, Percy took up the strain. The cable tightened. Percy pulled again. The cable stretched and held. Very slowly, Thomas moved backwards with his wheels running in the grooves on the side of the rails. Then, with a jolt, first came one pair of wheels, then another, and at last the third came safely back onto the firm part of the railway. The men unhitched the cable, and Percy was coupled properly to Thomas. "Thank you, Percy," sighed Thomas gratefully, and Percy pulled him home. Golden Jubilee. Back in the autumn, a spider had found a warm corner underneath the signal box at the junction. She had woven a web, pointed at one end and shaped like a funnel, and for a while she lived very well on what she had caught in it. Now it was spring, and the spider had moved on. She knew nothing about the preparations for the Golden Jubilee. "It's going to be a disaster," remarked Henry gloomily. "Important people, a special train, and nothing for them to see." "Ugh, you're all misery," said Donald. "Look on the bright side. There's a way to go yet." "I'm sure it'll be all right," put in Daisy. She had been shy about living in the big shed at first, but was getting used to it now. "Of course it will," agreed Duck. "Have we ever known any of the Fat Controller's plans to go wrong?" "No," admitted James. "I've never known that." The other engines agreed, except Henry. "There's always a first time," he muttered darkly. But by the time Jubilee Day arrived, Edward's wheel and Thomas's branch line were both mended. The Fat Controller told Edward he was to run ahead of the special train to make sure the line was clear. "Does that mean?" he asked excitedly. "Wait and see," smiled the Fat Controller. Crowds began to gather at the big station. There was to be a red carpet, speeches, and a special luncheon for the visitors. "Last time we had a red carpet, the Queen came," remarked Gordon. As the special train drew to a halt, Emma grinned happily at Edward. "Got your old signals arranged?" she asked. "Off you go then. We'll follow you in a few minutes." At the junction, a breeze blew into the room beneath the signal box. It wafted the old spider's web between two electrical contacts. At once, everything in the signal box stopped working. Signals went to danger. Points couldn't be moved. "Now what?" exclaimed the signalman. "There's a royal train due in 5 minutes." Edward stopped outside the signal box. Thomas, Percy, Toby, and Mavis were already waiting. The electrics are dead, the signalman told Edward's driver. We shall have to flag you all through, but it'll take time. You must go first, then the Royal. Carefully, men with flags sent the trains on their way. Edward went first, with a letter for the Fat Controller telling them what had happened. Pip and Emma went next. Finally, Thomas and the branch line engines were allowed through. At the big station, the crowd was now enormous. The Fat Controller looked impatiently at his watch. Gordon, Henry, and James had got the best places at the platform. We shall see everything from here, said James happily. If there's anything to see, grumbled Henry. Just then, they heard a whistle. That's Edward, said Gordon. He's had a wasted journey. Poor engine. But we know Gordon was wrong, don't we? Pip and Emma soon drew in, and onto the red carpet stepped a royal personage. I apologize for the delay, sir, said the Fat Controller, and he explained what had gone wrong. Then he introduced the royal visitor to each of the engines. I've heard about you all after the Queen came here many years ago, he told them. I am delighted to meet you all for myself. The engines whistled loud and long. The royal personage grinned and covered his ears. The Queen was right, he told the Fat Controller. Your railway and your engines are a credit to you.